I've been going back and forth between iOS and Android for over a decade now. In the early days of smartphones, I always liked the variety and wide selection of devices you got with Android, and on the flip side, iOS always seemed like it had a more reliable and frankly better overall experience, but I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. Both of these operating systems have changed a ton over the last couple of years, and while there is a ton of overlap between each of them in terms of what they do and how they operate, there's probably just as much that separates them. The question is, how much do these differences really matter? Let's get into it. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. If you've been on the channel for a while, you probably know that I've been switching between Android and iOS a lot lately, but historically that hasn't really been the case. The first real smartphone that I owned outside of a BlackBerry was an Android, which I stuck with for years, and I always loved how customizable Android was with all the different specs and designs you had. Then when I got into mobile software development more, I started really leaning into iOS and fully committed to iPhone for reasons that I'll explain in a bit, but so much has changed since then between yearly version updates and all these new AI features that if you're on the fence about which platform to choose, it can be a complicated decision. So before we get too far into that stuff, I want to start off with some differences influenced by the actual hardware. Mainly biometrics. One thing that you'll often see built into Android displays that have never existed on an iPhone are in-display fingerprint readers, and these days, outside of iPads, you don't see fingerprint readers in any new iOS-based devices at all, where you see them in almost every Android phone, and there are both advantages and disadvantages to using them and how they're utilized. One positive is that you don't have to lift your phone up or have your face in view of the front camera or sensors to unlock your phone, which is nice. Say if I have my phone at my desk, it's a little easier to access. That being said, when you have a phone with Face ID or decent face unlock, the experience can feel a lot more seamless than having to press your thumb into a phone every time you want to use it. Both of these platforms do have Face Unlock, but to this day I've never found anything that matches Face ID on the iPhone, and a big part of that is because of the technology that it uses. Where most Android phones just use a front-facing camera for Face Unlock, Face ID on the iPhone uses the front camera combined with infrared sensors and a dot projector that, with the help of the neural engine, creates a 3D map of your face that is much more accurate than almost any other phone's Face Unlock. That means that Face ID works regardless if it's light or dark or if you're wearing glasses, and it's highly secure as well, which is why you're able to use it with most banking or payment apps, where on Android, depending on the phone that you use, you'll likely only be able to use fingerprint biometrics with those. On iOS specifically, you can also lock apps and create hidden folders that will only show or work with biometrics or by entering a PIN code. Android does have something similar, but it's a little more fractured and based on the manufacturer. Samsung has Secure Folder, OnePlus has App Lock, and Pixel phones, to my knowledge, are a little bit more limited, where you'll likely require a third-party app to achieve something similar. But the main difference is that iOS is doing this on a system level, where comparable options on Android are essentially add-ons, which does make iOS feel a little bit more smoother and cleaner. Speaking of apps, hardware does come into play there with how each platform works as well. Not so much in relation to performance, as most phones these days have more than enough power, but more because of the difference in chipsets and with software development. So let me just explain this a little. If I'm developing an app for iOS, I really don't have to worry about app compatibility across devices like I do on Android for a couple of reasons. For one, new iOS versions have a much higher adoption rate over Android, which means that as a software developer, I can use newer APIs and I generally don't have to worry about supporting older versions as much, where on Android, because adoption is much more fractured over a ton of different devices, if you want decent device coverage, you'll have to rely a lot more on older APIs. For you as a consumer, that can translate into buggy or unstable apps at times. Because Android has literally thousands of phone models, it's a lot harder to support every device, especially if they're working with hardware on the phone. And I personally had a couple really bad experiences with drone software on Android that was the final straw in me switching over to iPhone full time. Now, that has gotten a lot better in recent years, and the gap has closed quite a bit, and any of the bigger apps will probably be pretty seamless regardless of platform, but I know with a lot of smaller apps or businesses, there can still be a tendency to focus more on iPhone first, because you do run into a lot less issues, so you will often find experiences are generally a bit better on iOS. One app that I have found works well regardless if you're on iOS, Android, PC, or Mac, which I did use quite often while developing software and is the sponsor of this week's video, is NordVPN. NordVPN allows me to connect to servers in over 118 countries, which was perfect when I'd be developing apps and need to appear somewhere else, but it's especially crucial when traveling. If you're connecting to public or hotel Wi-Fi, you're not only vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks, but a lot of those networks will also sell your data. And NordVPN essentially creates a tunnel that keeps all your information completely private. On top of that, they also include Threat Protection Pro, which blocks up to 85% of phishing websites and can detect fake shopping sites before you enter payment details. Definitely nice to have, considering a lot of these phishing sites are getting pretty convincing. They've also got a dark web monitor that continually scans for your data in leaked databases and alerts you if it's been compromised. And I think the combination of having both a VPN service and all these other security features make this an incredibly valuable tool regardless of which platform you're using. If protecting yourself with NordVPN interests you, you can visit nordvpn.com/Ericsson and get an exclusive deal on a 2-year plan with 4 months extra and a 30-day money-back guarantee completely risk-free. So please check out the link in the description if you're interested. Back to iOS and Android. Earlier, I said that I originally liked Android because of how customizable it was, and while it still is a lot more customizable than iOS, that is another area where the gap has closed quite a bit. If we look at the lock and home screen specifically, on iOS, I can now move icons anywhere that I want, I can adjust text and add widgets, and I can change the icons to be in dark or tinted modes, with text visible or hidden. Android is fairly similar in that regard. I can also add widgets, and I can customize or adjust individual icons or even adjust the icon or grid size, which iOS can't do. But specific things like tinting the icons don't work quite as well as iOS, where you'll usually see some that are tinted and some that are stuck with a stock icon. On the lock screen, iOS is also a little easier to show and organize widgets, where it's more of a pain to adjust on Android, and again, that all changes depending on which phone model that you're using. You also can't stack widgets on Android like you can on iOS, or hide or show specific home screen pages like you can on iOS. This is really useful on iOS. Say if I customize a focus mode to turn off or on at a specific time, I can have certain screens only show when I'm in those focus modes, and I have shown how I've done that in videos before that I will link in the description, but natively Android does not have that option. You can find third-party apps or launchers to adjust a lot of this stuff on Android that can completely change the look of your phone, which is an advantage in itself, but I'm more so just looking to stick to the stock functionality on these devices, and to be honest, I don't think that these are really make or break features. The more important things are going to be features that you're interacting with frequently throughout the day, and a big one that Android does a lot better in my opinion is notifications. I find Android notifications to be a little more organized, with multiple notification channels that are individually configurable. For example, I can set different sounds, vibrations, and visibility for each app, where iOS lacks granular control with no per-channel settings. Android also has notification history where iOS does not. So say if I accidentally dismiss a notification on iOS, there's no way to view it again, where on Android, I can go into my settings and view any notifications that I've received within the last 24 hours. Android also has more actionable notification options. I can directly reply or act on certain notifications where I'm not able to on iOS, and there's more one-touch actions like copying text or numbers, but iOS is slowly coming along where Apple is now starting to incorporate priority notifications in iOS 18 and notification summaries, which, to be honest, isn't really all that useful. Most of the time, it's going to try and summarize long messages or groups of messages into something short and readable, but it can be pretty horrendous at giving you an accurate summary. Sometimes it's good for a laugh, but that's about it, and this is all part of the introduction of Apple Intelligence, which, at this point, might be the biggest stumble Apple has made, maybe since the introduction of Apple Maps.
It's Apple Maps bad.
iOS was supposed to introduce contextual awareness in Siri this year, and that simply hasn't happened, where, on the flip side, most popular new Android phones will have Gemini as their on-device assistant, and the difference between the two is night and day. Siri will often struggle with complex questions where it'll either default to a web search or have an intermediary step where it'll tell you it needs to use ChatGPT to correctly answer you, where you have to tell it it's okay to search with ChatGPT before getting anything back, where on Android, Gemini will just find what you need and the whole process is a lot more seamless. Gemini also has a live feature where I can have a conversation with it instead of using text, and I can also give it access to my screen or the camera to show it what I'm talking about, just to give it some contextual information. That works pretty well. It's not perfect by any means, but I don't get anything like that on iOS. The closest thing I would say to Gemini Live on iOS natively would be something like visual intelligence, where on the new iPhones you can hold down on the camera button to get more information about pictures you take, but this is really only useful for doing things like web searches for specific items, and functionality beyond that is currently region locked to the US. Android also has Circle to Search on a lot of devices where you can circle things on your screen to get more information about them, which iOS doesn't have, and that continues in the Photos app, where there are a bunch of AI features on Android that you just don't have on iOS. This, again, is going to be pretty device dependent. Each manufacturer is going to have their own set of AI camera tools, but there is a lot of overlap on Android where you usually have some form of a magic eraser for removing things, something for unblurring or sharpening photos or enhancing them, and Samsung and Google have generative AI features for adding or replacing elements with your photos. Google will also have things like Add Me or Best Take that add something into a photo or change a face, but in a general sense, these all work better than on iOS, where the only real enhancement you have is the cleanup tool, which will remove things from your photos, but doesn't work nearly as well as on some of these Android devices, especially on something like the Samsung S25 Ultra. On the video side of things, one thing that I want to mention that I see a lot of Android phones struggle with are the lens transitions, which are often really janky compared to iOS, and some features like cinematic mode look a lot better on iOS versus similar ones on Android, and generally, I think the iPhone is still the best option for video, but Android is definitely much further ahead with anything AI related. Outside of the camera, Android can also be much better at multitasking, as you're able to split screen apps if you want, which doesn't exist on iOS. I don't know that a ton of people do this, but it still can be useful nonetheless, but probably the most important things out of anything here are the last few things that I want to talk about, and that's related to the keyboard and some of the functionality surrounding it, and of course, the ecosystem. Now, in regards to the keyboard, I'd say that the typing experience doesn't vary a ton whether you're using standard input or swipe functionality. On Android, you will often get a number row at the top of the keyboard, which I like, and iOS doesn't have. And I can also do things like voice type without the keyboard being present on Android, and dismissing the keyboard itself, which I can't easily do on iOS. iOS does have Genmoji available in there for making your own emojis, which I've honestly honestly only used a handful of times, but Android has a clipboard manager where iOS does not, and within there you've got a little clipboard history where you can paste both text and images or screenshots that you've taken, but I do find that the act of copying and pasting images specifically is a bit clunky on Android. The clipboard manager itself is definitely a great feature to have, but with images on iOS, I can hold down on pretty much any image in any app in the OS to copy it, and then I can paste it into any other app or to or from my Mac, which we're going to get into in a second, but I can't really do anything similarly natively on Android, and it's one of the features that I use the most on my phone. As you all probably know, if you've watched the channel before, I do use a Mac the majority of the time unless I'm gaming, and being able to easily copy and paste images and texts between my devices has been a game changer. If I'm on my Mac, as long as I'm on the same Apple ID, I can copy and paste things back and forth, receive and answer iMessages, mirror my phone on my Mac, airdrop files back and forth, scan documents, use my phone's camera as a webcam. The list goes on and on. On Android, you can do some of these things between your phone and Windows, or if you're locked in a manufacturer ecosystem, they might have a couple of ways to easily drop files back and forth. Or you can use a third-party tool like Blip to mimic AirDrop between devices, but Apple is still the king when it comes to having a fully functional device ecosystem. I know a lot of folks might also like to use iMessage over SMS for group chats and things of that nature, and there's also a bunch of gimmicky features that we could get into, like animated text and stickers and all that good stuff, but I'm essentially just trying to give a broad overview of the things that might be useful or that people will actually use between the two platforms. Some other random things to note. iOS is usually a little more consistent with updates, where all supported iOS devices get updates whenever a new version gets released, where on Android, you're usually waiting for manufacturers to release their flavor of Android, and iPhones do retain their resale value a little bit better than Android devices, so something to consider if you're on the fence with either of these, but hopefully that gives you a fairly good breakdown of each of these at a glance. I did have a bunch of other notes with other features that I didn't get to in this breakdown, but please, if there's anything that you want to bring up that I did not mention here, or maybe something specific to a manufacturer or a third-party tool that you find useful, please drop those in the comments down below, but that's all I have for you today. I hope you found this video useful or enjoyable. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content, or help me develop a new phone operating system that runs on Windows Millennium Edition, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.